Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Thank you, and welcome to the Not Old Better Show. I am Paul Vogelzang. You know, before there were highways, subdivisions, shopping centers, and city skylines, the American East, where I live, belonged to giants. Bison moved through Indiana and Illinois. Elk ranged across the Appalachian. Wolves and cougars lived in forests we now think of as entirely human territory. Then astonishingly quickly, they were gone. Then astonishingly quickly, they were gone. We remember the great wildlife of the West, Yellowstone, Montana, the open plains, but we have largely forgotten the wild East, along with the animals that shaped it. Today, some of those animals are returning, and their return is revealing a story far more complicated than a simple conservation victory. Elk now thrive on Appalachian land scarred by mountaintop coal mining. Bison graze restored Illinois prairie, but behind heavy fences, red wolves survive because people rescued them from extinction, yet their future in the wild remains painfully uncertain. So, what have we truly restored? And how much wilderness are we willing to accept when it crosses a highway, damages a farmer's crops, wanders onto private property, or appears in our own backyard? Our guest today spent 6 years traveling across the eastern United States, speaking with biologists, hunters, landowners, conservationists, and the people living alongside these remarkable giants, these remarkable animals. Smithsonian Associate Andrew Moore is an environmental writer and the author of the fascinating new book. Really, I just enjoyed this immensely. The title of the book is The Beasts of the East, The Fall and Rise of America's Eastern Wilderness. Smithsonian Associate Andrew Moore will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check our show notes today for more details about his presentation. But we have Andrew Moore today, and he'll tell us all about his presentation and share this wonderful story about these giants, these animals. It's also a story about memory, responsibility, compromise, and whether we can still make room for something truly wild. Smithsonian Associate Andrew Moore, welcome to the Not Old Better Show. Smithsonian Associate Andrew Moore, our guest today. It's so good to see you. Thanks for joining us today. We're talking on a Saturday, Andrew, so I really appreciate that Smithsonian dedication, sir.
You got it. You got it. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Of course. Absolutely. My best to you. Congratulations on the wonderful book. Beasts of the East is the title of your book, The Fall and Rise of America's Eastern Wilderness. Just a wonderful book. We'll have links so that our audience can find out more about Andrew Moore's work, his new book, his upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation. But we got you today, Andrew. So I've got some questions that I've kind of lined up that I think are going to focus us and get a little bit of insight into your wonderful work. I want to start with a subject that's kind of near and dear to me, and that's the subject of sound. I kind of work in that industry a little bit. My wife and I are real hikers, and we love to be outdoors. We do take our dog with us. We've kind of trained him to not bark in the out of doors because we just like to listen. And you describe in your book a sound that was very meaningful to you, and I kind of want to begin there. You describe this really cool sound of tens of thousands of sandhill cranes that are making their wonderful call, rising from kind of an Indiana wetland. Very, very well written, and those calls really are drowning out everything else around them. But this migration, interestingly enough, is taking place beside a coal-fired power plant. So really interesting kind of juxtaposition there. So when you stood there listening at that moment, what did that scene tell you about the wilderness, and particularly a wilderness that was in Indiana and not where we might normally look, kind of in the West?
Right, yeah, right here at home, right, in the East or
Yeah.
Midwest, in this Indiana, when people think about Indiana or Illinois, they often think, after the cities, they think about, the cornfields, right? And just,
Hmm.
the word that's often used is, like, sterile, right, for cornfields and how, flat, the country is and just corn, that's what people often say.
Yeah.
Um, but just so that wetland I went to, the Jasper-Pulaski, wetland area where these cranes migrate, it's not the only place where they congregate in the region, but that's where the most of them go. And there's also the, cooling ponds of the coal-fired power plant where they will go, which is not far from the Jasper-Pulaski, area. And the sound is just rambunctious, it's noisy, it is not a peaceful, quiet, North Woods setting. It is just full of life and loud at the crack of dawn. Louder than any rooster crowing on a farmstead. And it's unruly in a sense and untidy, wetlands can have that feeling as well as, you don't really see where does the land end, right? Or where does the dry land end? Where does the wetland end? And it bleeds and blends into one another. And just the fullness of that sound really just filled, our senses kind of work together. So the trumpeting of these cranes filled my ears, and then that, in a sense, filled my eyes, and the whole scene was just full, and I think that fullness, is something that I'll always take away, from going there.
Well, thank you. I thought that was just kind of an interesting place to begin because it I could tell in reading it, it meant an awful lot to you, but it also meant an awful lot to me because of this idea of sound and how important it is. And we tend to kind of miss some of that out in the wilderness. And you write about the subject of conservation and as I was doing my research for our conversation today, I kept returning to this one notion, this one kind of almost startling fact about the East, and that is that bison, elk, wolves, cougars weren't just these kind of occasional, visitors here locally. I live in the East Coast, but they belonged here, and we don't see them anymore. And so, what was it so much about a kind of older, wilder East that's now vanished so completely from our kind of American imagination and the presence here?
Yeah, and so you're asking me what is it about the East that has vanished, or what we've lost?
Yeah. Yeah, what's taken
Yeah.
place and what's, kind of we don't have that so much anymore, yet it was just such a, almost
Yeah.
commonplace. Especially the elk, I think were that really was a powerful moment
Yeah,
too.
right. So elk being in the East, it's not just that there were occasional elk or a few bands of
Yeah.
elk once in a while. They filled the landscape in some places. And for some indigenous peoples and communities, elk meat would have been this really important source of sustenance. Perhaps second behind white-tailed deer. Their hides would have been used, their bones became tools, and we have this we know this because when we look at prehistoric sites, we find elk antler and elk bone tools for farming or for prying open muscles. So yeah, they were present in the East, throughout the East, and they were utilized by indigenous people, from the meat on their bodies down to their bones. Um, and as you're saying, that they weren't just occasional visitors. They were here, and they were here for a long, long time. Um, and because we've transformed our landscape so dramatically and filled it with, you know towns and strip malls and highways and are a lot of the habitats of the former a lot of the elk's former habitats, often we think anyway that it would have been some of the grasslands and the meadows and savanna like habitats that were in the east. Those were some of the places we filled up first with modern human settlements. So it can be really hard for us to even picture that these animals were present, not just present, but abundant in the east.
Yeah, abundant and so very noticeable. But I thought too, as I was, again, researching and thinking about this subject, that while they were very visible, it also seemed very apparent that we were losing them. That the bison, the elk, the populations. You think about the passenger pigeon as just kind of a different example, but nonetheless, we saw this take place, and I wonder what was it that that really, was about these populations that, we mistook, why didn't we see this properly? And yet we just kinda kept on killing perhaps and clearing.
Yeah. You know, perhaps, we did see it, and in fact, we in some cases, we celebrated this, destruction. Certainly when it came to the large predators, the wolves, the panthers, not only did we see them begin to vanish from the landscape, we encouraged it. We put bounties on, some of these predators. Um, and that, without being too harsh on, people who lived hundreds of years ago, um, that was their job. The Euro-American settlement of this landscape, the purpose was to tame the wilderness. That's what they set out to do. So, we look back and we see the destruction, and certainly some of these people who were living in that period, they lamented the last elk to leave Pennsylvania. When it became really apparent that, oh, that might be the last elk in the woods of Pennsylvania or West Virginia. There were folks that were wistful for the past when that large game was common. But they kind of just chalked that up to the price of progress. That this is what we were setting out to do. We were going to drain the swamps, cut the forests, and tame this landscape. Put farms and settlements everywhere. Um, so it was really a worldview, right? That uh, brought us to that point. It was this conquering of the landscape um, that not only made it possible, but that was the point of the American enterprise in the East.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's important to not be harsh on some of these generations that have come before, and I think it was largely their jobs, and I think that they took those very seriously. But one of the strangest stories in the book was the question about the elk's return, because I thought that was that was an amazing part of the book, almost a story about this return of this population to a location around coal mining. You mentioned West Virginia and Pennsylvania, just kind of right next door to where I live. And I thought it was interesting that the elk were looking at some of these grasslands and seeing really wonderful, suitable, kind of habitat. Yet the very people that were living in these places, trying to eke out livings and form their own, lives, they may have seen something very different than a return of the elk population. They may have seen elk that were kind of taking over roads, that were destroying crops, that were being, their own almost invasive selves.
Yeah, yeah, and the introduction of elk to East Kentucky, and this is where, and in my book, that's this turning point for putting elk in the East. There were some states like Michigan and Pennsylvania that reintroduced elk in the early 20th century, but these were very small populations. And what they were doing in East Kentucky was moving 1,500 large elk from the west to the mountains of East Kentucky over the course of just 5 years. And at the when it was just an idea, most people were on board. They were saying, "Look, we've got these strip mine habitats or strip mine landscapes. We don't really know what else to do with them. We think the elk will do really well there because they eat grass, So if we put them in these places, we think we'll have an opportunity to restore an animal that was driven to local extinction uh, several generations earlier. B, we think it'll be an opportunity to create some maybe ecotourism. People will come and see these animals. But the big project, the primary, reason for doing this was, it was driven first and foremost by, hunters of East Kentucky. They said, "Let's bring this animal back to give us an opportunity to introduce a game species that's indigenous to Kentucky. This animal had been here. Let's bring it back so that our sportsmen and women will have an opportunity to hunt this species." Um, and for, some people in America, they who are maybe don't grow up with the tradition of hunting, they might think that is, a little odd that that a hunting group would be the reason why this large animal was brought back to the East. But folks from that tradition, from that conservation sporting tradition, don't see that as contradictory at all. They understand that the tradition of restoring much of North America's wildlife came from that hunting tradition from the early 20th century. The various fish and game departments, the League of Sportsmen, with water, it's the Isaac Walton League. These people who have their hands on the animals, who are on the landscape, um, pursuing game, consuming game, and just really personally invested. Um, and so that was the picture that, these people had this vision for bringing these animals to Kentucky. That's kind of how they sold it, and pitched it to local populations. And most people were on board, right? But when you've got animals that weigh between 600 and 1,000 pounds ambling across the landscape, you are inevitably going to have some conflict. Um, you know, and so some people have had problems. People have hit elk with their cars. People have had elk in their gardens. And it's a new problem, right? And so people get very frustrated with problems that are introduced to their lives. If you grew up with a problem, if you grew up with, um, groundhogs digging in your garden or white-tailed deer like so many of us in the East live with, you can just kinda say, "Okay, well, this is nature. This is what it means to live on planet Earth." But when you bring a new thing in, even if, this thing had been indigenous to this place, the people growing up there didn't think that, and so they saw that there were, conflicts, of course. But it seems like the folks of East Kentucky have reached some sort of understanding about living with elk and figured out how to minimize those conflicts. And also, often the solution to some of these problems has been hunting, right? So, like, if there are elk congregating in an area, like a farmer's field, if those animals are hunted and removed from that place, they realize that they're not welcome there, and so they make themselves kind of scarce. So the motivation for bringing elk to East Kentucky has also sometimes been a solution to some of the problems.
Yeah, very well said, and you do such a nice job in the book of kind of balancing, I think, all of that. Congratulations on that because that's a challenge, and I wonder who was it. We'll call we have the conservationists on one side, and then we have those that may not always agree about the value, but we'll call them maybe the opposition. Did you meet somebody in the opposition camp that really kind of changed your mind about this subject and that really brought you to this point of balance that you really see because you do again you do a very nice job of seeing kind of both sides of this, presenting it.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for saying that. I mean, obviously that is the challenge,
Yeah.
right? Is to present the nuance in of these situations, and they're not just black and white. I think if we're still just speaking about the
Mhm,
elk,
mhm,
I wouldn't say that there's like a camp, right? Or there's not like organized opposition to elk. There's just individuals who are
mhm.
impacted. I spoke to one farmer in southern West Virginia, and so most of the book is about Kentucky, but West Virginia, within the past 10 years, has also introduced elk to their southern coalfields counties. And I was talking to one farmer who was trying to make a go of farming a mountaintop removal site, with all kinds of challenges to that endeavor. And he was talking about the elk that were coming to West Virginia, and he did not see it as this wonderful restoration. He saw them coming for some of the crops he was going to be growing, and he wasn't thrilled about that. Um, the challenge, though, is that to keep in mind that the elk were indigenous to the central Appalachia and many other parts of the eastern United States. And although it's inconvenient to have this massive hungry animal coming to your farm, I still believe, and as do many people, of course, that they have a right to be in the world, right? And so that is the challenge, is not ignoring those conflicts, but looking at them and trying to find solutions. And sometimes that is excluding animals from a given area, and these are problems that people have where they live with large ungulates everywhere. It's just that when you get to the eastern United States, you often get a lot more people in a lot smaller place, and then you fill it with animals. And so sometimes those conflicts can be intensified.
Yeah, so I'll personalize this just for a moment. I live in Virginia. I'm a former federal employee. Part of my job meant driving to a location in West Virginia, Parkersburg, West Virginia, very much on the
Hmm.
far kind of western boundary of West Virginia and Ohio. And I had to leave very, very early in the morning in order to drive to Parkersburg. And the roads of West Virginia are beautiful, and the roads were practically vacant. But I would come around some turns very early in the morning, and I would see these massive. It's hard to really get a sense as to how big these elk are until you're kind of close to them, and so it really is
Yeah.
an impressive thing, and they're
And
there.
when you see an elk next to a deer, as you sometimes do, oh, they dwarf that deer, and you understand, oh, this is a much different beast, if you will, that we're dealing with here.
Yes. Well, so many
Yeah.
of us online have seen the incident in Yellowstone with the buffalo, the bison attacking kind of the individual there, and I wonder, because we talked about the elk, let's talk about the bison, and really because they're an interesting part of the book too, and another
Mm,
big story in your book, but they
yeah.
bring up this really kind of interesting question, and we saw that with the incident perhaps in Yellowstone. What do we mean when we can call an animal wild? I mean, they're being placed into these locations for purposes of tourism or ecotourism, but they are wild.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, even bison in a fenced enclosure, as individuals, they're still wild animals, and of course, in my book, I go into a lot of this, and maybe we'll discuss it, but there's a lot more at play about, there's a lot to fencing a bison, right? But again, at the end of the day, the point is those are wild animals, and you're not you're not you shouldn't get close to them, because of what can happen to you. And when these things happen, they're tragic, and I feel terrible for the people involved. But they are reminders that these are wild animals that have their own s- autonomy, right, on the landscape. And we might think that they exist for one reason, but they have their own ideas about who they are and what they're doing on the landscape.
Well, let's talk for a second about this idea of fencing because certainly the bison are back, on the prairie, and but they do come with this necessary requirement, and that is fencing, close management. Um, you see highway, underpasses and overpasses being created especially for them. And I wonder about this idea of animals being able to migrate freely, choosing where they want to go. Yet, have we just created an animal that's carefully managed, or is this kinda still the original animal intact there?
That's a big question. Is this the original
Mhm.
animal? What was the original animal? what does the animal want to evolve as the climate warms, and as habitats change? Those are really big questions. I think that the thing to remember and really take seriously about bison, and you said the bison are back, and for over 100 years we've been celebrating that victory, that we saved the bison from extinction. um, you know uh, that was a dark point in American history, and in a history full of dark points, really, especially when it comes to wildlife. We almost drove this majestic, special American creature to extinction, and then um, some wildlife heroes, really. They gathered up some of the last bison. They put them on ranches. They bred them in captive facilities, and then slowly started returning them to the landscape, to the various national wildlife refuges and state and national parks. It was only Yellowstone where they continued to exist on the landscape, wild and free. But all the other bison you see in this country have been placed there. And with very few exceptions, those animals are all fenced. They're behind fences. And sometimes the acreage is massive, thousands of acres that they have at their disposal. And so those animals still have, interactions with landscape and landscape ecology. They're performing their role in these places, their ancient role, but they have real barriers that they come up against, whereas the ancient bison that evolved on this continent would have been able to move past those barriers, when the food was poor in a given area, or if predators were pursuing them, hunters, human hunters, of course. They would have moved. And when you look back at descriptions of the old bison herds, their movement is noted all the time by these early writers who were observing the wild bison. They were saying, just their how fast they are and how quickly they could just pick up and just move across the landscape. And we don't let bison do that in this country anymore. It's our national animal. It is a conservation story that we are proud of, but we can't lose sight of the fact that this species, and really this species of our large mammals, do we corral behind these fences. We let grizzly bears move about the landscape. We let white-tailed deer all over the country. They go where they will. They're in my urban neighborhood here in Pittsburgh. And there are conflicts with that, of course. But we are constraining the evolutionary potential of bison, and their ability to be a functioning member of the land community. We don't give them that opportunity. Um, Again, there are some great examples of bison on landscapes where the bison are functioning, but they're just constrained, and we're not letting them move about the landscape as they would have historically. And that can be problematic, of course, for the bison in terms of, genetically. It can be problematic for the bison, but it's also problematic for the landscapes. There are parts of the country that won't feel the tread of a bison that had felt the tread and the mouths of bison for a very long period of time. But we're not offering that opportunity to our ecosystems in much of the United States.
Smithsonian Associate Andrew Moore is with us today. Andrew Moore, of course, is the author of the excellent book, The Beasts of the East, The Fall and Rise of America's Eastern Wilderness. The book is excellent. Andrew Moore, congratulations on this. I want to talk to you about another couple animals. One I want to start with is the red wolf. And I want to ask you kind of a general question about what makes a red wolf, because we're able to get the red wolf to survive in captivity. Yet scientists are kind of debating its genetic identity a bit, its ancestry, and most of all, I think they're debating how to save it. And so if a red wolf can only survive inside a fence or a breeding program or captivity, what are we saving, really? Are we saving a version of itself? Is it the animal itself? And I think what really strikes me about this is, what's the possibility of a future for the red wolf?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of questions there, and
Yeah.
a lot to
Sorry.
unpack. I'll do my
Yeah,
best
sorry.
to basically just talk about the red wolf.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of asked originally, what is a red wolf? And
Yeah.
a red wolf is the name we give to the wolf that was indigenous to the southeast of the United States. It's the animal that had evolved in that part of the world, right? And when I say the southeast, I actually mean like southern Pennsylvania down to Florida and west to Texas. This is a huge swath of the country. And this is the animal that mammalogists, this is the name given to the wolf that was indigenous to this part of the world. And this name was given to the American red wolf by mammalogists in the early 20th century. And although there's been a lot of debate about what is a red wolf, and the debate is really driven by the fact that these animals, the last of them, were breeding with coyotes on the Gulf Coast. And if the animal can breed with coyotes, what does that mean, right? So, because we formerly had this firm biological species concept that was if two animals can breed, if they can produce offspring, that perhaps there's not a separation of species and that it's not a valid taxonomic entity. But lately, so the National Academy of Scientists looked at this recently and settled fairly once and for all that the according to all the best available evidence, although this animal hybridizes with coyotes, when it doesn't have mates available, which is what had happened on the Gulf Coast, we do believe that this is a valid taxonomic entity. So the consensus now is yes, the red wolf is a species, right? And what we've come to accept is that nature is a little bit more wily than the rules we try to put on it to understand it, and that hybridization occurs in nature. It occurs with plants, it occurs with animals. And so the fact that the red wolf will breed with coyotes doesn't make it less of a species, doesn't make it less worthy of conservation, just makes it a lot harder to conserve this species. Um, so backing up a little bit, the reason that we found red wolves breeding with coyotes on the Gulf Coast, and the reason that was a problem is because we, American society, had killed all of the red wolves that ever existed from the eastern United States, from that chunk of land I described, Florida up to Pennsylvania, west of Texas. We had killed all of them except for a few stragglers that were found on the Gulf Coast in southwest Louisiana and southeast Texas. And those stragglers wanted to survive, right? And they met and bred with coyotes that were coming in from the west. And we started to know about this in the late 60s. We got a good idea of what was going on. And by the time the Endangered Species Act was passed, um, the American people, the federal government, wanted to save this species from going extinct. We saw that there were few of these animals left, and it appeared that they would perhaps breed out of existence with the incoming coyotes from the west. And so as you said, we started putting them in captive breeding facilities, and we started trying to build up that population because, again, we had killed all of the wolves that had ever existed except for these few. And so the plan, the best thing we could come up with in the 1970s was let's put them in zoos, captive facilities, and breed them up and try to release them somewhere else, where they won't be persecuted by ranchers and where there are no coyotes to create this hybrid swarm problem, genetic swamping problem. At the time, we got this great chunk of land that came into the federal government in northeast North Carolina, and there were no coyotes out there that we knew about at that time. So we put the animals out there, and oh, it took a lot of hard work and it took a lot of resources and it took many years, but we built that population up in northeast North Carolina to over 100 wild wolves, and they were doing really well. So they could exist outside of fences. They could exist wild and free on the landscape. They were breeding. They were successfully raising litters, but also coyotes came. And they made it to North Carolina, and that those same problems that they were facing on the coast followed them to the Carolinas. This genetic swamping, this hybridization, and the goal of the Endangered Species Act and the recovery program for this wolf was to keep the red wolf in this world. Those red wolves may have some coyote DNA in them. They're not going to be the same red wolf that Europeans encountered when they came to the Carolinas in the 1600s. But this is the wolf we have now. And the Endangered Species Act and the American people still want to see it in this world. And so we are working to try to make that happen. And when I say we, I mean, us as this experiment of American society, we are trying to keep that species in the world. And it's difficult. The wolves themselves do well on the landscape. They find all the food they want. They eat deer, they eat nutria, they eat raccoons. They are breeding and having litters, so they are reproducing. The problem, in addition to the coyote problem for this red wolf, the problem is the old problem, and that is people killing these wolves and reducing them down to a number to where they might not be on the landscape and where they're going to want to hybridize again with coyotes. And so once again, what we're facing again is some of those old sort of societal things. We talked earlier about, settling the landscape, removing the animals, clearing the old growth forests. As Americans, we've done a good job of accepting, oh no, we want to have biodiversity. We want to have healthy ecosystems. We want to have these majestic game species like bison and elk. We've kind of come to a consensus that yes, we as Americans want these things around. The thing we haven't come to a consensus on is coexisting with these large predators like wolves and mountain lions. We're still working that out as a society. And kind of to get back to what you had asked about the future of this species, it's very much in our hands and unwritten, the future of this species. We have to decide whether it's worth it and whether or not we want to coexist with these red wolves, because we know we have the power to stop them from being on the landscape. So it's to be determined, to be seen,
Andrew Moore, talking to you today about your fantastic book, The Beasts of the East, The Fall and Rise of America's Eastern Wilderness. Andrew Moore will be at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes for lots of details about Andrew Moore, his work, his great book, and his upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. Happy Saturday to you and your family, Andrew Moore. We sure appreciate your being so generous with us. Again, congrats on this book. And I'll just be selfish here and just say, as you do more work on this subject, I would love to have you back. I know our audience is just going to be excited about this subject. We'd love to hear more from you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast.